We're here today to talk about lost continents, but there are also lost oceans. And if you want to help investigate one of them, the Sternberg Museum's science camps are accepting high school-aged applicants for their programs that are spread across many states. If you are 15 to 18 years old and thinking of going into paleo or geology, but you want to get experience with what the work actually entails, Sternberg's hands-on programs are for you. You can prospect in the field, you can prep specimens in the lab, you can learn the technology and practices that take a fossil to publication or put it in an exhibit. It's a chance to have fun and develop skills that you'll carry with you into your journey through the sciences. So click the link in the description for more information. Registration for 2026 closes April 10th, so don't delay, and happy camping. Take it away, me from the past. I came across an oddity in the history of paleogeography, the study of how the surface of the Earth has changed across deep time. In the Mesozoic, the age of dinosaurs, the supercontinent Pangaea split in two. We had Laurasia in the north and Gondwanaland in the south. More commonly, this is just called Gondwana nowadays, but I'm including the land for reasons that will become apparent. And I always assumed that the names of paleocontinents are fairly recent. Like, plate tectonics didn't really coalesce into our modern understanding until the 60s and 70s, and if you haven't modeled the movements of the continents so that you can turn back the clock and reassemble South America, Africa, India, Australia, and sundry to show that they all once nestled together around Antarctica, you would have no need to come up with a name for that supercontinent, right? Wrong. Gondwanaland inherits its name from a much older idea that the continents have always stayed right where they are, but had been linked together by extensive lost lands since disappeared beneath the waves. Why did some paleogeographers fill in the Indian Ocean? Well, in the 18th and 19th centuries, geologists spread out over the globe trying to correlate strata in one region with strata in another. In the interest of science, yes, but also to feed the European Empire's insatiable need for coal. The actual mineral makeup of the rock is only part of the picture here. Much more helpful are the plants and animals that are fossilized in it, the flora and fauna. If an organism only exists in a specific time interval, then you know that every rock formation that has that organism must have been laid down during that time interval. As long as it's a land or freshwater organism. Seagoing organisms are not as useful for this. And in a region of east-central India called Gondwana, they found this particular sequence of layers of rock. And they found this same pattern on multiple continents across the southern hemisphere. It came to be called the Gondwana system, or Gondwana series. In the Permian coal beds thereof, they found these distinctive, giant tongue-shaped leaves. They came to be called Glossopteris, the tongue fern, even though it's not actually a fern. It literally means like tongue feather or tongue wing. But Glossopteris and other plants like Philotheca were really strongly correlated with the Gondwana series, so they became the Gondwana flora. What was odd about all this is that the spots where they found Gondwana strata and Glossopteris were not contiguous. Like, we found beds in India and South Africa, but not in Arabia or Iran. It's as if the trees and bushes were somehow seagoing. And workers reasoned, correctly, that that meant that these landmasses must have once been joined together. But because the thinking was that continents can't move side to side, only up and down, there must have been dry land bridges, or maybe even entire continents that are seafloor today. We tried a few names for this paleocontinent, but because its defining characteristic was the presence of this Gondwana flora, the name that stuck was Edward Seuss's Gondwanaland. This was just one of the big ideas in Seuss's enormous 5-volume book, The Face of the Earth. He was trying to unify paleontology and geology, of course, but also present-day biogeography, meteorology, and even anthropology and mythology. He viewed the Earth as this interplay of a number of overlapping, ongoing processes. To Seuss, the way certain continents look like the shards of a shattered surface is because they had shattered. He thought the planet was cooling and thus contracting in a fractured, uneven way, with some blocks subsiding and neighboring blocks staying in place or even getting thrust upward. Unusually for a fixist, he recognized that the continents must have been moving laterally a little because of the way mountains are built, but he thought those were only secondary minor repercussions of the cataclysmic vertical movements. So the lands we call South America, Africa, Madagascar, India, and Australia were just fragments of a Mesozoic Gondwanaland that had been breaking down in periodic catastrophes since the Jurassic. Now I know what you're wondering, did Seuss apply this concept to what we call Laurasia? Yes, but only for the North Atlantic, where he was one of many workers to hypothesize the existence of a continent linking North America and Europe called Atlantis. As recently as the 1920s, we had an interesting situation where some geologists contended that a bridge or continent or island in the Atlantic had collapsed within human memory, thus inspiring the myths of Atlantis. But then we had other geologists insisting that even though we're calling the paleocontinent this, under no circumstances should we confuse it with the Atlantis of Plato. But to quote Suryakanti Chetty, mythological images of lost lands retained a hold on the scientific mind. For Seuss, Greenland was a shard-like remnant of Atlantis, like India was for his Gondwanaland. To Brooks, North Atlantis was Europe and Greenland with this isthmus over to Nearctis. For Arendt, it was about the same, but over the course of the Mesozoic, it absorbed more of North America with less and less of a connection to Europe. Von Jhering's Arc Atlantis was very different. It was a bridge between much of North Africa and Iberia over to Florida. Even Du Toit at first speculated that there could have been more or larger fragments trailed by the Guianas as they pulled away from Africa, now submerged, save for the Cape Verde and Canary Islands. Now, to be fair, we did name the ocean the Atlantic, so if you're putting a continent there, that is the logical name to use, but, well, the first chapter of the first volume of Seuss's book concerns itself with comparing ancient accounts of floods, like Noah's Flood or the Epic of Gilgamesh, with modern tellings of what happens during natural disasters like that. Partially, this is just to lend a sense of scale. You know, if even relatively minor events like these can leave such huge marks on human culture, well, how much more impactful must these events shaping the entire surface of the Earth have been? But mostly this is so that he can dismiss straight away the old idea that there was a recent global cataclysmic flood, which was an actual scientific idea a long time ago. And if that's your goal, it does make sense to use textual sources to reinforce that. You gotta give your audience something to latch onto, which is a theme we will return to. But there's a seductiveness to the idea that within myth, there is this core of truth or fact that we can extract and study, which seems relevant to Gondwanaland and to the persistent use of the term Atlantis. These geologists and paleogeographers, perhaps unsurprisingly for people who study the past, were very amenable to poetic and romantic notions that these scraps of the primeval world were still with us. To quote Seuss, "The powers of the deep have not retired to rest." The way they wrote about their subject, and especially the names they chose for it, reflect that predilection. Gondwana takes its name from a term for an Adivasi people who call themselves the Kotor, but outsiders call them Gonds. Gondwana or Gondaranya means the Gonds land or the Gonds forest. Whatever its literal meaning, it refers to where they live, the northern part of the Deccan Plateau. It is indeed heavily forested. It is hot. The fertile black soil is carved up into these dramatic cliffs and valleys. Europeans first encountered it during something of a fad for the classical antiquity of India, but the Gondwana region, its people, and its history were, in the European conception, something different. Some wrote about the Gonds as if they were a relict population of the original indigenous Indian culture. One writer even thought that there was continuity going back as far as the Pleistocene, which I think implies that he thought humans evolved here. The Gondwana highlands and jungles comprise such a large district of unexplored country that they form quite an oasis in our maps. Its dense forests and hilly country cut it off completely from the outer world, a terra incognita to Englishmen. Along this belt has raged the principal force of those subterranean fires, which in former ages have heaved up the central portion of Hindustan. The abode only of wild beasts beasts, demons, and the savage Gonds, devoid of any approach to civilization. It's as if the land itself is holding them in stasis or even pushing them back into what, to whites, resembled prehistoric lifeways. Which is awfully convenient to blame the land. You know, it's not the result of Marathan and then British pacification efforts killing and displacing them. You know, this isn't a culture in crisis that's been disrupted. No, they're just primitives. This is all fiction, obviously. Gonds were insular generally, but that's just how their society worked. We have a history of Gond kingdoms going back centuries. They had metalwork and agriculture that was indistinguishable from peasants elsewhere in India. They had social and religious traditions preserved by a class of bards. And they always had social and diplomatic ties with at least some of their neighbors. But in the 19th and into the early 20th centuries, the idea of Gondwana and the Gonds as this wild, primitive relic of the primeval earth, closed off to modernity, was an appealing concept to Europeans, including, and maybe even especially, to geologists. To quote Chetty again, the conceptualization of the ancient landmass of Gondwanaland was based on the convergence of both primitive peoples and a primordial landscape. Really, as soon as we had maps showing both the coast of the Atlantic in the west of Afro-Eurasia and the coast of the Atlantic in the east of the Americas, people started to notice that this looks like a really wide seaway. The Americas just fit into Europe and Africa. This has inspired a number of people over the centuries to propose that the continents had moved apart over time, which is what happened. But the dominant view in the 19th and early 20th centuries was that the continents we have today had stayed right there, with more or less extensive bridges or entire continents connecting South America and Africa. These have several configurations and designations. The earliest is possibly Brazilian-Ethiopian continent. I never said all the names would be catchy. Others are just the western portion of Gondwanaland, often South Atlantis. Still others are precursors to it, like Flabellitis Land, which was supposed to exist in the Devonian. A name that Du Toit called as inappropriate as the name Brontosaurus Sea would be, which really makes me want somebody to name something the Brontosaurus Sea. Von Jering had connections persist through the Paleogene. Arc Hellenis in the south to correspond with Arc Atlantis in the north. Another worker, Willis, was unconvinced there were any landmasses worth calling a continent. He reconstructed what he called granitic apophyses, like the Brazil-Guinea Isthmus, running under what is today the Fernando de Noronha and Sao Paulo Islands, with another jutting off of Angola and then up the mid-Atlantic ridge. To Willis, the South Atlantic in the Permian formed an enclosed Caribbean. So even before plate tectonics, Gondwanaland was not the only game in town for your southern paleocontinent needs. In the Indian Ocean, we now know that in the Cretaceous, the landmass we call India broke off from those we call Antarctica and Madagascar, and then rapidly, for a continent, crossed the Tethys Sea, creating the Western Indian Ocean. But it wasn't a clean break. There were bits left behind along its path, the mostly underwater Mascarene Plateau and the Seychelles Islands. For early paleogeographers, this whole band of ocean was a perfect candidate for a lost continent. Probably the most famous one not named Atlantis, they called it Lemuria. This was a supposed Neogene bridge between Madagascar and India to explain how non-simian primates got where they are. Incorrectly, I might add. Lemur's Indian and Southeast Asian relatives got over there by way of Africa and Arabia. The fossils we had back then just didn't show that. There's also certain bustards and a genus of bulbuls, neither being birds known for crossing entire oceans, that also show very closely related species in separated regions all around the rim of the Indian Ocean. Biogeographers sadly never named a theoretical landmass Bulbulia. They did come up with even more variations than the South Atlantic. Connected to Africa, there was the Indo-Malagasy Peninsula, or Willis's Africa-India Isthmus, a narrow, snaky thing closely following the modern ridges and islands. Others had further-reaching lost landmasses, like a different iteration of Arc Hellenis. The most ambitious was probably Haug's Indo-Malagasy Australian continent. He was working from an incorrect theory of how mountains are built. He pictured the Mesozoic with most modern mountain ranges and island chains inverted, forming these narrow seas with everything else being land, grouped into 3 or 4 continents tightly nestled together. Don't ask me where all the water went, maybe they were just really deep. Most didn't take things that far, but because the bathymetry of the ocean floor was extremely incomplete back then, seemingly any seamount could justify throwing a bridge across an ocean. All this while, one of our modern-day continents was nearly as theoretical as the ancient ones. Antarctica was, its interior at least, practically impenetrable to humans before the early 20th century. We had known that continental crust must be down there for some time because rocks that are produced by mountain building kept turning up in icebergs. We would find granite and gneiss, and we would find quartzite in the crops of penguins. It amuses me that, like, of all the lines of evidence, the dinosaurs helped us. Proposed paleocontinents for this region include von Jhering's Archenotis, this long snaky thing from the Antarctic up through the Andes, which were called Archiplata, to the Rockies, or as von Jhering would later call those, Schukertland. Clark's Antarctic continent in the Devonian consisted of Chile, the Falklands, and the Antarctic, which he called Falklandia. As for the present-day configuration, when Robert F. Scott's first expedition, Discovery, set out, they expected that they were probably going to find a series of large islands surrounding an ice-capped ocean. So it turns out, we named Gondwanaland before we named Antarctica. Seuss, perhaps unsurprisingly, favored the idea that these landmasses were joined together, but he also supposed that this Antarctis had once connected to Patagonia and Australia. It would later turn out that one of the samples recovered by the Discovery expedition in 1903 actually did contain Glossopteris leaves, but at the time that Seuss was writing, that was sitting in storage at NHM London. It hadn't been cracked open yet, wouldn't be for decades. So Seuss's Antarctis was not part of his Gondwanaland, at least not biogeographically. That wouldn't happen until after 1912, when a search party found the frozen remains of Scott and what was left of his second expedition, Terra Nova. With them were geological samples collected as far south as the 85th parallel, including Glossopteris leaves. So we found out that Antarctica had been part of Gondwanaland at the same time that we were finally confirming that it was a whole continent. As we saw with Atlantis, the Northern Hemisphere was not exempt from speculative paleocontinents. Darwin and Hooker both observed that paleogeographers were prone to throw land bridges across oceans to explain any inconvenient faunal or floral correlation, only to quite recklessly sink them again. Some of the names they chose for these are still in use, like Baltica or Angara or Cathasia, but most of them aren't, like Gobia or Tibetia or Tyrannus, which are all pretty self-explanatory. Nearctis and Palearctis correspond to the eponymous biogeographical regions. Iria took me a minute, it's Erie as in Lake Erie. Archiboreus, as you can probably guess from the name, is another of von Jhering's, as were Pacific land bridges. Pasila, connecting Central America and the Caribbean over to Hawaii and the Marshall Islands, and or Arca Galenus, which extends that up to the Kamchatka Peninsula. The actual situation is that Laurentia split from Eurasia as the Atlantic opened. Large areas of both are indeed underwater at times, but Fixus geologists couldn't account for the violent collision of Africa with Europe or India with Asia, because they were working from a fundamentally different idea of how the crust makes mountains. How was any of this supposed to work? Well, at the time that Seuss was writing, we had measured the gravity at enough different spots around the Earth to notice that oceanic crust is distinctly heavier than light continental crust. In Seuss's model, Earth was layer upon layer of nested interacting spheres. The core of the planet, the bathysphere or Nipha, the interior, the mantle or Sima, layers of crust called the stratosphere, which is confusing, or Sial, the waters of the Earth, the geoid, life, the biosphere, which is another term he coined, and air, the atmosphere. He envisioned the whole surface of the planet was once this primeval, shallow global sea dotted with low islands. He called this Panthalassa, the all-sea. And from that more or less homogeneous starting point, continents rose because lava flows reworked into sediment by erosion and deposition, and ocean deeps sank as layer upon layer of lava made them denser. Which is not how that went down, but the name was good. We still use Panthalassic Ocean for the engorged Pacific that once surrounded Pangaea. Another result of those gravitic measurements is the observation that the oceans stick to the continents a bit. The water surface is higher near the shorelines and lower in the middle. Seuss correctly surmised that this had something to do with how mountains are built, but he had the mechanism wrong. Willis was actually closer. He recognized that the heavy oceanic crust would get forced underneath the continents, but he was envisioning it more like ripples in a pond, not the oceanic crust shoving the continents around laterally. The actual process is that currents within Earth's mantle drive this conveyor belt-like motion of the ocean floor. New crust emerges at the center line with slow, constant subduction near the coasts, where heavy plates sink down as these high-density slab graveyards. The gravity of those graveyards deep below the margins of the continents pulls water away from the weaker gravity of these low-density plumes that they shove crustward. The strongest example of this is in the Indian Ocean, where the surface of the water is like 100 meters lower out in the middle than it is at the shorelines. Seuss was under the impression that the effect was 10 times as strong as it is, which led him to two conclusions. One, the difference in elevation between the deeps of the ocean and the heights of the continents is actually significantly higher than we realize. And two, as a consequence of that, as the gravity of Earth oscillated, or shards of crust would get thrust upward or driven downward, or even just the expansion and contraction of the ice caps at the poles, areas might alternate between hundreds of meters below the ocean or hundreds above it. What this meant for the plants and animals that were trying to live on these land masses was that any area that wasn't thrust up into mountains or plunged down into the sea was what Seuss termed asylums. It's similar to the Ice Age concept of refugia, areas that are spared from glaciation, where animals and plants can hang on until better times, that is, warmer times, return, and they can recolonize as the ice recedes. But this is across a much longer time scale, where we have taxa that had been widespread across ancient supercontinents divided by geologic activity. The mainland would then see a turnover, but what we would call basal taxa persist in regions now isolated by oceans or deserts or mountains. Du Toit phrased it as primitive or long pedigreed forms found in such places. Animals like large paleognath birds, blind snakes, or lungfish are almost exclusive to the ancient lands of the southern hemisphere. Seuss said that asylums reveal themselves as ancient lands by their geology and by the residues of past faunas. He called the Tuatara a remarkable relic of the Permian epoch. I would observe that the way Seuss talks about asylums resembles those flood myths he started his book with. You've got a period of disturbance where some area is spared and life is preserved and can spread out and recolonize the changed landscape. They're like tectonic arcs. Workers back then were not only interested in the disruptions in Earth's history, but also in its continuities. And they had an expectation or even a presumption that those continuities would be more prevalent down in Gondwanaland. In 1837, Hugh Falconer, good name, thought that since Europe had produced the iguanodon, and America the even larger Basilosaurus, which at the time was still considered a reptile, it was only a matter of time before the tropics would yield yet larger reptiles. This was his way of introducing his description of Megalochelys from the late Neogene of India. It is still the largest tortoise known to have existed. He took the trope of tropical ecosystems as holdovers of the ancient world in a surprising direction. He linked Hindu myth with Indian fauna. Elephants, pretty self-explanatory. Vasuki would be inspired by the python. Garuda by the greater adjutant, which in fairness are sometimes called Garuda birds. But then the tortoise avatar supporting the world would have been inspired, in Falconer's conception, by Megalochelys. Not fossils of Megalochelys. Falconer thought that early humans had encountered living giant tortoises. And I should note here that we did, but it was Homo erectus, and it was in the early Pleistocene, and it was in Southeast Asia. Now, myths and legends can encode information about the past. We have examples where people have preserved traditions like the eruption that created Giwas in what is today Oregon, or the flood that separated what we call Tasmania from what we call Australia. And that information persisted across incredibly long timescales. But this is not that. This is guy who has only seen Boss Baby seeing a second movie and getting Boss Baby vibes from it. Falconer does not restrict the Megalochelys inspiring myth concept to the Indian subcontinent. Oh no. He invokes various traditions of world turtles or turtles as land masses in myths from all over, ranging as far as the eastern woodlands peoples of North America. This would have made perfect sense to Falconer, because it fits into a centuries-old strain of thought in British and French anthropology where societies they consider primitive share a common culture with ancient and prehistoric societies that they also consider primitive. But this was all just means to an end to Falconer. The actual point that he was building to was that since, obviously, Megalochelys must have persisted into recent times so that humans could encounter them and have myths about them, that means that the strata we find them in must be really recent. We would use anything to correlate strata back then. Falconer demonstrates this predilection that life in these parts of the world retains an ancient character. He says as much. He mentions that, other turtles and crocodiles that were contemporaries of Megalochelys persist in India. Why couldn't the big guys? I just think that's a notion that we should be cognizant of, that the landmass that the next generation of workers would call Gondwanaland remained primeval while Laurasia continued to develop. And it's somewhat ironic that paleogeography as a science followed something of the opposite trajectory. Wegener's continental drift theory of the 1910s and 20s met a largely hostile response in Europe and an overwhelmingly hostile response in North America, but workers in the former Gondwanaland took it and ran with it. Geologists collating reports from all over Gondwanaland long before it had that name noticed something odd. The deposits that were coal-bearing in the north weren't in the south. And they eventually figured out that it's because they had been too cold. They had evidence of glaciation. This somehow included tropical regions in India and Central Africa, where the ice had been spreading away from the equator, which makes no sense at all. One theory was that some areas of Gondwanaland were just so enormously high elevation that constant monsoon-driven fogs would prevent the sun from warming them, and that's how you could have constant presence of glaciers. Du Toit in 1921 had a simpler solution. He reassembled the former jumble of southern continents, and that arrangement explains the ice sheets. The continents were near the South Pole at the time. Carboniferous glaciers formed a polar ice cap. This also revealed that the Permian Gondwana flora forms this continuous belt, which might explain why, even though other plants that were members of the Gondwana flora spread out across Pangaea, Glossopteris never did. Maybe it was limited to just high altitude or high latitude environments, or maybe there was some kind of climate change that got him, or maybe it was just outcompeted in more temperate zones. Whatever the case, it's kind of ironic that because Glossopteris doesn't persist into the Triassic, it never made it past the Great Dying, it never lived on the actual separated Gondwanaland, only on Pangaea. Regardless, Du Toit's ideas weren't widely accepted at the time. It wasn't until the late 60s, early 70s that more geomagnetic data, primarily spearheaded by the British, and the US Navy finally declassifying the bathymetric data that they'd held for 30 years for no reason, finally let us put together the modern synthesis of plate tectonics. Naomi Oreskes characterizes this as a transition from geologists with their hammers, field lenses, and field notebooks to geophysicists with seismographs, magnetometers, and computers. But if Du Toit's ideas were so unpopular for almost 50 years, why am I mentioning it? Well, because unlike seemingly every other paleogeographer we've talked about, Du Toit did not come up with a new name for his conjoined southern continent. He just called it Gondwanaland. But he never said why, at least not that I could find. Why did he keep the name Gondwanaland for his condensed version of the southern supercontinent? I can guess that it was probably a combination of respect for Edward Seuss, as well as the fact that the name was already established. It's the Gondwana flora, it's the Gondwanide orogeny. He's proposing a literally earth-shattering shakeup of how paleogeography works. He can at least meet the traditionalists halfway by preserving the name. More broadly, and the reason why I went so far into the weeds researching this, I wanted to know why the name Gondwanaland stuck when so many other paleocontinent names haven't. Like, when I was a kid, you still saw Gondwanaland in books. Now it seems that Gondwana has kind of superseded it. A cynical reason might just be branding. Gondwana is associated with the coal deposits that are the reason these geological surveys were being conducted in the first place. More charitably, it might just be a really good name. Seuss was good at those. He chose elements with appropriate symbolic meanings. The Tethys Sea is the waters between Laurasia and Gondwanaland, covering a large part of modern Europe and West Asia, the progenitor of the Mediterranean, Black and Caspian Seas, and parts of the Indian Ocean. The mythological Tethys was the Titan mother of numerous spirits of various seas and rivers. It just fits. J.R.R. Tolkien called Gondwanaland that rare venture of geology into poetry, and as is typical for him, I'm not 100% sure that's a compliment. Suryakanthi Chetty put it more academically. She said that when we're considering these interactions between history, mythology, and geology, we contextualize the distant unknown within the familiar, which is a statement that could also apply to a lot of dinosaur names. So if the name Gondwanaland lends context to prehistoric Earth, we should try to understand what that context was and what it meant to the people that invoked it, even if it won't make their maps any less ridiculous. I want to thank you for watching Your Dinosaurs Are Wrong. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. I'll have a toy, I promise. We would like to extend a special thank you to these individuals who have gone above and beyond to support this show. We could not have done it without you. Thank you.